Now, live from Whitney Media, 1460 WVOX, the Greenburgh Report with Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner. You can join in the conversation at 914-636-0110. Now on 1460 WVOX, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor with Danielle Jacoby, who's an intern. And we have a really interesting program today. My guest is Charles Copeland, a resident of Hastings, who is the head of an engineering firm, Goldman Copeland. And he's been involved in some amazing landmark projects, Grand Central Terminal, Carnegie Hall, the Empire State Building, the Alexander Hamilton U.S. Customs House. Those just are a few of the clients he had. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit of, what was the most exciting project you've worked on over the years?
That's tough, but I'd have to say Grand Central because I worked on it for 15 years. And we started in late 88, and then pretty much from 89 on, we worked on it continuously. Did all of the infrastructure over. Some of it dated back to 1913 when the terminal was built. Many challenges because the terminal had been sort of deteriorating as a result of the Penn South or the Penn Group's history of bankruptcy. And so we wound up having to fix a lot of things that were on their last legs. And of course, many of the tunnels had homeless folks in it that were living there. So whenever we had to walk into them, we had to be super careful. But that was probably our most interesting project.
Do the architects generally hire you, or do the municipalities or organizations hire you?
Well, at this point, most of the projects we do, we are considered the prime, and we engage the other folks as needed. We do some projects as sub-consultants to architects, but a lot of our projects, let's say the Dance Theater of Harlem, we just redesigned that. We engaged the structural engineer, we engaged the architect, and we redid all the infrastructure on that lovely building on like 149th Street, as I recall.
What would you say is the most difficult project that you've worked on?
Ooh. Well, they're all challenging. Maybe the Alexander Hamilton Customs House might have been one of the more challenging projects because it was historic. And then, as I was mentioning, we then put the Museum of the American Indian in it. All of that had to be done very carefully so that the historic structure would be protected because, museums have to have a higher humidity level, and we don't want the moisture affecting the invaluable historic structure. So that might have been my most challenging, but right now I'm working on many historic buildings, historic houses of worship. We just finished the St. James Episcopal Church. We're working on the Central Presbyterian Church. We worked on Central Synagogue. We work on many historic buildings. So they all have their challenges.
What made you decide to go into this field?
Good question. Well, I grew up a little bit in Queens. I was born in Manhattan. And unfortunately, my father left us early on. So I wound up moving up with my grandmother in Dobbs Ferry, believe it or not, and going to Ardsley schools. And I did pretty well. And instead of being, I was the first to go to college. Instead of just being an auto mechanic, as they suggested, my friends said, hey, you did pretty well in school. Why don't you go to college? So I went to college. I took a train, went out to Missouri, went to a school out there, eventually getting an engineering degree. But in the process, it was the time when people were thinking about space travel. And I said, gee, do I want to become an accountant or...
We have to take a break. An accountant or an architect?
Or an engineer. I became an engineer.
Oh, that's great. So we'll be right back with Charles Copeland, who has really distinguished himself as one of the premier engineers in the country, dealing with Grand Central Terminal, Carnegie Hall, the Empire State Building, the Alexander Hamilton U.S. Customs House, and many other projects.
The People Program, WVOX.
That's my station.
Westchester Radio for you and yours. 1460 WVOX.
Now, back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor. And Danielle Jacoby and I were interviewing Charles Copeland. And Charles Copeland is celebrating the 50th anniversary as the head of a firm, Goldman Copeland, that's celebrating 50 years of landmark projects. One of the questions that was raised in the past in Cranes was, how do you upgrade old buildings without affecting their integrity?
That's certainly a challenge. But having worked on older buildings forever, since our beginning, I always appreciate their original structure. So what you have to do is be very careful about how you approach it. So, for example, when we did the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, I looked at the beautiful interior and decided there's no way we were going to first air condition it by introducing any unsightly ductwork or something like that. So what we did is we came up with a way of delivering the air under the kneeling rests so that nothing would be ever disturbed in the building. And we did it in a way that was very fire safe, which unfortunately in the old days they weren't built with our concerns for fire safety as much. So we built concrete under it and so forth, and we delivered the air. So now the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church is all cooled that way. So that led to about a year ago somebody calling me, who used to be on the board there, saying, well, we're going to renovate the Central Presbyterian Church, and I was a director at Fifth Avenue. Could you do something like that there? And sure enough, there was actually even little duct stubs under the pews. So we're actually going to redesign the Fifth Avenue Church, the Central Presbyterian Church, similar to the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian, and not affect the architecture at all.
Do you think there's particular challenges to these projects happening in Manhattan rather than in a suburban area per se?
I think in New York City, the regulations about landmark buildings are pretty rigorous. Mm-hmm. There's not much you do that doesn't have to be verified by the Landmarks Commission. So I think probably in New York City, it's probably the least place that you would find somebody adversely affecting at least the exterior. Most interiors are not landmarked, except for something like Grand Central. Most interiors are not landmarked, so there you could sort of deform the interior. But that's something when I'm doing infrastructure, I think about a lot, not affecting this gorgeous old structure in any way.
Now, you've lived in Hastings, and you're the fifth generation in Hastings?
Yes. My grandmother came and met her husband here and was working at the Christie Estate where she met him, which is where Food Town is. My mother was then born, and the rest of her brothers and sisters. And then subsequently I moved there and brought up my daughter. I have 3 children. And my daughter subsequently, after working at the Washington Post for 11 or 12 years, came back to Hastings, and she's bringing up her children in Hastings.
And you live in a very interesting house.
Yes. Yeah, I live in a house which is on right next to Broadway. It was built by one of the Ziegfeld Follies girls, as they called them, and it was built in a beautiful style. It's right on Windsor Road, and then subsequently, as a result, or as a connection, I've worked on many Broadway theaters. The most recent being Disney's Frozen. We redid the St. James Theater. We just recently did the Hudson Theater a couple years ago. So we do our share of theaters, Schubert's, so forth.
Is theater work a little different than, say, the Empire State Building or Grand Central?
It is, because buildings like the Empire State Building have complex mechanical systems, different zones of pressure. The pressure at the Empire State Building on some of the water systems is huge, like 600 psi. Whereas a theater is, what you're trying to do in a theater is keep the occupants comfortable, keep the air moving, have enough fresh air in there, etc. So it's quite a bit different, but it's important.
You must get a tremendous amount of satisfaction every time you go to a theater that you help build, or if you go to the Grand Central. Do you feel a little bit of ownership and like a pride?
I do. And in the case of Grand Central, as far as architecture goes, we reused the old columns that were empty, that were originally meant for air, but was never installed. I guess they ran out of money even in 1930. 1913. So we used those columns for supplying air. So the concourse, the main concourse, for the first time, for the last, I guess, whenever we finished it, in the mid-90s, is now air-conditioned. So I get a lot of pride out of walking through there and seeing the system still working, keeping people cool.
Right, we have to take one more break, and I'll be right back with Danielle Jacoby, and we'll be talking to Charles Copeland, who's celebrating 50 years of landmark projects with his engineering firm, Goldman Copeland. And they've also done work in Westchester at New York Presbyterian Lawrence Hospital in Bronxville, Hastings on Hudson School District, and the Irvington School campus. So we'll be right back. I'm Paul Feiner.
With
1460 WVOX.
Now back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and co-hosting this program is Danielle Jacoby. Danielle, do you have any questions?
Yeah, so in looking at your past, and obviously you've been very successful with your company, how did you become interested in engineering?
Well, I can't say it was something that I grew up as a 5-year-old thinking that this is what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. Some people do that. I think the head of Google, one of those gentlemen, grew up with his father teaching him how to put everything together. It sort of was something that came to me as being reasonably good at math, and liking to solve problems was something that kind of came to me. And many of us in the 60s were kind of motivated by what was going on with the space program and all that. So that's really how we got into it. And then once I got into it, I sort of understood which direction I was going. And in one case, when I worked since I was 13 years old, and one time I had a job at the Museum of Modern Art, believe it or not, packing books and so forth for the end of the year, and I got a tour by the head of operations there, who gave me a tour of how they maintain this museum, and I sort of said, that might be an interesting area for me to go into. That sounds like fun, something would be good to do. So that's kind of how I got into it.
What advice would you give to students who are thinking about going into engineering?
I would say there's a lot to be interested in it, and it's not just doing programming. It's fun. I work on a lot of old buildings. Just the other day, I was invited to look at a structure that crosses 32nd Street, which was the original access to the Gimbel's department store that they want to recapture and use it as a reception space. And it was just fun. It's fun looking at old buildings. It's fun working on them. So it's not all about just sitting in front of a computer and doing calculations. It can be also going and visiting sites. So that's what I really enjoy.
And what's the biggest problem dealing with clients?
For most of my commercial buildings, all major landlords in New York, Empire State Group in Veronado and so forth, I don't have very many issues with clients. I think the issues for somebody like me is more like if you're involved in residential buildings, co-ops or condos, those become a little more challenging in terms of meeting everybody's expectations.
Right, and you were talking about geothermal during the break. We, in the town of Greenburgh, used geothermal at the library, and we thought would win a prize for the geothermal, but it didn't work.
Right, and unfortunately, we've seen a lot of that. We actually did a screening tool for New York City for every lot, 850,000 lots, and typically it doesn't work by itself in most lots. First of all, many of the buildings are too tall for the loading, and if you do use it, it's usually got to be a hybrid system, which
that's
means
what we're doing at the library, right?
Yes, and so I'm actually working on a project, a private school that got a lot of publicity for using geothermal. Unfortunately, they put in like a couple of 100 tons of air conditioning, and the temperature of the well field rises. So they have water that should be 85 degrees is now 110, 120. So we just finished a report on how to address that by putting in supplemental cooling to deal with this small well field. Meanwhile, even though they put a couple of 100 tons in, our screening tool said it was only good for 82 tons. So our screening tool wasn't that far off, which was kind of surprising.
Oh, wow. For the Greenburgh School District, a bond referendum just went down. The Greenburgh schools are independent of the town, and the school district claims that the buildings are all, in bad shape. They're old. The wiring is bad. Do you ever do independent analyses? Because one of the problems is that people don't trust the government, no matter who's involved in the government, and would it be prudent for municipalities or school districts before they do projects to have an independent firm like yours look at all these infrastructure problems that are alleged to be problems, and then you have like a second opinion?
Sure. As a matter of fact, this project, this geothermal project, started as a peer review as to why the system isn't working that well. But typically all buildings, whether they're done as a peer review or independently looking at them, I look at many buildings that are being proposed to be purchased by one of my clients. I must look at 2 or 3 a year, big, large buildings. And one of the things we do is we go into the building and determine what's the prospective anticipated cost in the future. Is this going to fail in the next few years? Or, make an allotment of funds to cover these things if you're going to buy the building, and it also affects the purchase cost. So typically we do look at lots of buildings from that perspective.
Sometimes when I review the quality of work, I see that you're not getting as much as the new buildings may not last as long as the old ones. Are you finding that's a problem, or is it just? Is there
no? It's definitely an issue, especially with infrastructure. A lot of these, a lot of structures designed by well-known architects are all about the building and not about the infrastructure, and how do we make sure that this infrastructure doesn't deteriorate in 15 years. So many of my projects are all going in to fix infrastructure in fancy buildings, so to speak, that haven't been able to be maintained properly. That's the case of, the St. James Episcopal Church, all the stuff they put on the roof, just failing within a short period of time.
Well, like a school or a government, they may say, okay, we'll go cheap because we want to be under budget, and then it may last 10 years or 15 years rather than 50 years.
Exactly.
Right. We have to take one last break. It's going too fast. I wish this was a 2-hour program instead of an hour program. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and we'll be right back.
Good.
Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, this is Paul Feiner, and my guest is Charles Copeland of Goldman Copeland, an engineering firm. And Danielle, you have a question?
Yeah, so you worked on Disney's Frozen Theater on Broadway. How much air conditioning and general renovation was required for that?
Sure. So, of course, we redid all the air conditioning for the where the audience is. That was a big system, probably 100 tons of air conditioning. But what was interesting is we put a separate system in for the actual production area and the stage, which by itself was roughly 35 tons. And that served the displays, the 1,000 or million LEDs that are there, and all the areas where the tech areas where the folks below have to operate that whole system to make it such a beautiful production.
You're also celebrating the 45th anniversary of a pioneering solar rooftop project, and I'm interested in that because we put solar panels at the town hall. I think we were the first municipality in the Hudson Valley to do that. But I'm wondering how you engineered and designed solar.
Sure. So, of course, this was not solar to electric. This was solar thermal. So this is how you heated your water, domestic water. The interesting thing is the Lower East Side of Manhattan in those years was really in bad shape. Many of the buildings were abandoned. You wouldn't know it now because the apartments in some cases go for $1 million apiece, but many of the buildings were abandoned. The street I was on 13th was all abandoned cars. So we had a group of folks that were going to move in there that wanted to do good things for energy, which is something that's been part of my career since the beginning. And so we came up with the idea of putting in solar panels on the roof, and I did a lot of studies to figure out what was the good combination of solar versus storage and so forth. And then subsequently they put up a windmill to generate electricity. And that became a contentious issue for some good reasons with Con Edison and some reasons that weren't so good. The good reasons was simply that you wouldn't want to have electricity going into an underground feeder when a work person was working on it. The bad part of it was there needed to be a way that people could contribute some way, like you did with the Greenburgh Town Hall or whatever, and put the electricity back into the grid. So that became a very significant project, which resulted in a ruling called PURPA, Public Utilities Act, which allowed anybody with proper protections to be able to supply electric energy into the grid.
Is solar becoming more practical now? The technology seems to be changing very rapidly.
They keep getting better and better. The collectors now transform a lot more energy into electricity. However, as a practical matter in complex building areas like New York City, where the structures and the roofs are de minimal compared to the amount of electricity being used, I'm not going to say it's a practical application, but certainly if you're talking about places, residential areas like Westchester, Greenburgh, and so forth, those would be good applications for solar.
Yeah, we're looking at a solar parking area.
Yeah, wonderful.
That's one of my goals for the future. You've also done work at Carnegie Hall, and my sister is a classical pianist.
Really?
My niece is also, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that client.
Sure. Well, we did the big one, the big renovation to it. And it was a complex job. One thing that was very critical was sound and noise and acoustics, which we all had to, doing the infrastructure work when designing air conditioning and all of that, you had to be very cognizant of. And of course, as you know, if you've been to Carnegie Hall, if you sit on the right side, you will hear the trains going by. But we had a well-known acoustical consultant from Israel that worked on it. One little interesting story is that when it was completely finished and everybody thought it was perfect, somehow the musicians on stage, probably it was your sister or whatever, it might have been her too, said, "You know what? There's something different about the sound on the stage here." And everybody said, No, what's the problem? It's just fine. So after the musicians commenting on it for, maybe a year, finally somebody decided to open up and look in the stage, and they realized that they left a layer of concrete under the stage.
Oh, my gosh.
Which had to be removed, and then the sound immediately got much warmer, and the musicians noticed the difference.
Well, the steam explosions are also an issue in engineering. And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So steam is generated very efficiently in New York. It's called cogeneration. But there are many leaks and there are challenges. So I was the expert on the steam explosion that occurred at 41st Street. And basically, that occurred because of the injection of chemicals into flanges that got in and clogged the steam traps. And it's a little beyond this discussion to explain what actually happened with the high-pressure steam. But this, going forward, is something that everybody has to be more and more concerned with because of global warming and moisture and rain and getting into these places that could cause the steam condensation to exacerbate and possibly create another steam incident like this.
We only have a few seconds left, unfortunately. Does your firm have a website?
Yes.
And what is it?
Well, it's just GoldmanCopeland.com, I guess.
That's great. And you indicated during the break that you have a couple interns working for you this summer.
Yes. Yep.
And do you recommend internships for students who really want to make a career?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, at least one of them is from Westchester.
Oh, wow.
She's very bright.
And
young woman.
And what type of what are you looking for when you're hiring interns?
We're looking for somebody that's interested and wants to work. That's all. They don't have to have special training.
That's great. Well, it's a real honor interviewing you, and
Thank you.
We're so lucky to have you in our community. I'm Paul
Thank you so
Feiner,
much.
Town Supervisor, and Danielle, thank you for co-hosting the program.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us.